So welcome to the webinar for this Friday. This is our second time that we've been doing this as something a bit more topical. And I hope that you find this interesting. I've had fun preparing for this, and I have a lot of different examples to go through. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Pamela Schultz, and I do a lot of the technical support for Datagraph and the voice of the videos on YouTube. And these webinars are something we started about a month ago. And our intention is to really continue this. And it seems as though Friday at 11 will likely be a reoccurring webinar that we do on different topics and doing demonstrations of different things that we're working on in terms of improving the program and adding things to our beta also. For example, this week, we've been working quite a bit on implementing a new grouping mechanism for the thumbnails that are in the program, which is something that a number of our users has asked for, and I think will be a really nice addition to Datagraph. So for today, what we're going to talk about is related to the webinar that actually we did last week, and we'll be making that webinar available on YouTube. This webinar is also being recorded, and we'll be sharing the webinar with everyone who's registered. We'll also be taking excerpts of that and likely sharing that eventually on YouTube as well. And so anyway, so the topic today is going to be talking about how we drill into data sets using the COVID data sets that we talked about last time as examples data that we're going to use for this. And I guess just to get started, let me go ahead and share my screen with you. And hang on one moment. Great, okay. Still getting used to Zoom sometimes. Here we go, sharing my screen. So now you should see an image that has a bar graph on it that has actually been in the news this week that I thought I'd just point out, since this is something that we're going to talk about. And the controversy was over this graph that was posted by I believe it was the Department of Public Health in Georgia. And the graph itself shows you a series of days worth of data for 5 different counties. And you can see this is for the top 5 counties with the greatest number of confirmed COVID-19 cases. And the issue here is that if you look closely, the dates along the x-axis are not sequential. They actually jump around between April and May. And they give the impression of this being a downward trend when in fact it looks slightly different if you sort it by the actual dates. And also you can notice that the bars themselves are also are not consistent. So I don't see this, the first bar is a particular county, but the first bar that you see in each one is always different. They have the same, they're color coded, but they are different. So anyway, this was something that had been pointed out, that this really is a little bit of an inappropriate way to explore this data and to show this data. We're going to talk about ranking today as one of the things that we do. And we'll be using, not this data set, but we'll be using one of the country data sets to perform that ranking using the pivot command primarily. So for example, if you look at this data and you want to see what does it look like with the appropriate sort, well, it still shows, click on this, make this a little bit bigger for you. It still shows a considerable downward trend over the days that they're showing. This is just over 15 days. But it's not as consistent. And in fact, I find this a little bit hard to read in terms of what we're really seeing here. If you focus on it for a while, you can see some of the trends within the counties, but the bars are also overlapping. So I'm not sure this is really a great way to explore this data anyway. And we'll talk about some other ways that we can do this that might be a little bit more effective. Now, I just want to go ahead, and as we continue, my screens get a little shifted around. I want to make sure I can see the chat window in case anyone has any questions. So just give me a moment to pull that up again. There we go. I have two screens I'm working with, but sometimes things get, Zoom tends to shift things around. Okay, so another thing we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about moving averages. And this is just a screenshot from the Johns Hopkins website, daily confirmed cases over a 5-day moving average. And this is something I'm seeing people do a lot online. They're posting not just necessarily individual days worth of data, but rolling averages or a moving average, however you refer to it. And we're going to talk specifically about how we do that within Datagraph and what techniques you can use. So first, let me just show you a file that I've posted online. So if you go to the file and within Datagraph and go to online examples, I just posted a file just a few moments ago before the webinar started that has some COVID data sets and example graphs in it. And there's a lot of stuff in this, but this is the file I'm going to work off for the webinar. And if you'd like to go ahead and open this up and follow along and play with these examples, you can do that. So let me go ahead and open the file up that I have here. So just let me give you an overview again of some of the things that we're going to do. Last time, the first webinar that we did last week, we did a lot of pivoting of the data, and we had things grouped by country at that point. Here's a set of data. This is from the World Health Organization. I have this data using the pivot command, and the data is grouped here by different World Health Organization regions, which are roughly continents, but not exactly. I have another data set that's from the European Data Center, and this has, again, data here we are grouped by continents. And then we have another number of graphs in this file that, again, have data ranked in various ways. We also have these graphs where you see, again, this moving average type of representation of the data layered on top of a daily count of the number of new cases reported. And that graph I have doing this in a number of different ways, overlaying two countries, having two countries with the axes, side-by-side axes on them. And if we continue, I guess just quickly, just to cycle back to that first example we saw, here is an example of a pivot graph within Datagraph where we have a time axis is our x-axis. We have bars that are grouped here by country. This is sort of similar to that graph that we saw for the counties in Georgia, where what the pivot command does is it will take different countries or whatever category that we would like. And if you have an x-axis that is a date axis and you have it as numerical, then it will group all the different categories together. And I guess a couple of things. One thing is that I find, we'll just go quickly here back and look at, this is the pivot command that creates this. When you go into this command, and I will, for those of you who maybe aren't familiar with this, I will create this from scratch as well. But just so you can see, when you see these pivot commands, you can open them up, and there are two settings here for mapping rows and mapping columns. Where rows here is my date axis. This is data or cases that's being summed per week. And my columns here are these different countries. And in fact, these are the top 5 countries that are ranked with the highest number of COVID cases overall throughout the pandemic. And another way that we could change this, if you go over to the pivot command and look at the type setting, then we could not just do X standard, but we can quickly change to a stacked representation. And I find for a lot of data, if you have a lot of different bar graphs that are all lined up, it can be difficult to see really where things are going up and down. The stacked representation can give you a better sense of that. There are some limitations with this because depending on the data, it might also give you some false sense of some things growing or shrinking. But in any case, I think overall it gives you a better sense of this data as compared to looking at this standard graph. So could be a bit of opinion. I like the stacked representation here. You can see the total number for these 5 countries, and you can get a sense of certain countries increasing, the number of cases reported in Russia, for example, increasing, and other countries decreasing. There is also in data graph an option in the pivot to do an area graph. Here I have data being summed over a week. You might want to change the time, instead of mapping it on a weekly basis, to change it to a daily basis to give you another way to look at this data. But again, very quickly I can sort of change these settings and get these different representations. One suggestion that I saw for this type of data online, instead of the grouping by date, would be to group by the actual category itself. So here, for example, is the same exact data as this graph. It's another pivot command. It's actually the same command. It's just pivoted now on the columns instead of the rows being our x-axis. And that also is a very easy thing to do. Now I color-coded that version that you saw there, but I could change this. It's this group bar setting. Instead of having it by row, I can have it be by column. Now I have all my countries grouped in a particular way, and my legend becomes a documentation for me of what the date ranges are for each one of these bars. In the graph that you see here, I was playing with this a little bit and decided that I would have every 4 weeks be kind of a highlight color, and so you could get a sense of the same time periods between these different countries. Anyway, again, different representations of the data that we can flip between very easily without having to change any of our data at all. Very easy to do. Finally, in this file, you'll see that there is a graph that shows us a line graph of the number of cases that have been reported for different countries, and the smoothed or moving average version of that is also being shown. Okay, so hopefully you'll can have some fun playing with that file. Just want to keep track of our time here. Now, the first thing that I want to do before I actually get into using some of these data sets is I would like to start with a brand new file, and I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the use of moving averages and how we can do that within data graph. And I'm going to create just a very simple example with a function that I have that I'm going to set up. And actually, let me make sure that there's a separate chat window and separate Q&A window, and just want to make sure that I have both. Okay. So one of the things that is convenient to do within data graph, and again, I'm just going to make up some data just to illustrate this technique for you and show you how you can calculate these moving averages in different ways. So we'll go ahead and start by just adding an expression column. And I want to and we'll use a sine function just to use a simple mathematical function. And we'll go ahead and use our number field first to create this. So if you've never done this before, this is sort of a handy thing to be able to do. The row counter is something that is an object that's within my list of columns that's always there. And I can use that as a variable in one of my expressions. So if I put the row counter symbol, which I'm using the default of the hashtag, it's going to ask me, well, how many rows do you want to see? And I'll just say here 100. So notice that just very quickly creates for me my own column of 1 to 100. And I'm going to use this as my X column. I'm going to make another expression, and we'll make that sine of X. And if you want to plot this data, actually this is my Y, we can highlight this, click the plot command, and you can see this function here. Now, I don't want it to be oscillating quite as much, so let's just go ahead and divide this by 10. So here's a smooth function that is a known value. And in our COVID data, we likely have some underlying trend that's going on, but there's a lot of noise in some of the data because the daily totals are reported at different times and they're not, exactly succinct to that day or tied to that day in reality. And which is why you have some days that have much higher values than others. And again, is what's driving the use of these averages over time. So what DataGraph will allow me to do very quickly is, if I have a number column, you can click on the gear menu and you get access to all these shortcuts. So I'm going to use a mapping shortcut to add some noise to my values. So this will be my Y that's noisy. And what this did is it just automatically added this expression, Y plus NRAND, which is a normal distribution, and this is adding noise. Okay, if you're not interested in the mathematics of it, doesn't really matter, but let me just plot this data so that you can see what I did. So now I have these points that go around my function, and let me make it a little bit noisier than it was, maybe even a little bit more than that. And I can hide my, whoops, let me hide it from there. I can hide this function from view. You can kind of see the trend here, but again, we have all these individual points along the way that have this noise hidden there. So a moving average is one way to smooth out a function or to eliminate that noise. DataGraph has a couple of ways of doing this. We can, again, go over to the gear menu, and I can say, I can go to these mapping shortcuts, which are really they're shortcuts to doing different expressions. And one of them that's here is the average of the last 10 rows. Notice for the first 9, there is no average because it's using this expression that is referring to prior rows. If you've never done expressions like this in DataGraph before, basically what you're able to do is you can use any number column, and if I say Y, and I use my current row and subtract 1, I don't know how well you can see this, but hopefully it's not too difficult. What I did is I took this column and I mapped it into a different row. So not too difficult, but just a way of being able to refer to these different rows. In any case, this column here is my average of 10 that I can do very quickly. Now, I just wanted you to know that this is there. I don't tend to use this as much, but it is a way to show you quickly how these expressions are formed. This is a little bit of a cumbersome expression since it has 10 different values. You could build these yourself in whatever way that you would like the averages to be done. But another approach is to use what we call a plot action column. So if you go over the other menu, click plot action, you'll see an interface where you can enter different values, and I can enter my X value. I can click on my title here, drag and drop for the menu for my Y, and there's a number of different mathematical actions I can do. I can integrate, differentiate, but what I'm going to do here is actually smoothing. And it gives me a method of smoothing. I can do this based on an average, and I can change the number of values that I have in my smoothing. So if I want to, let me plot this value, my Y, this will be my Y smooth. And actually I want to use this in a lines command. So let me go ahead and do this as a, if you notice, I tend to use all the time this option dragging to clone my commands. Very, very handy. And let's go ahead and delete that one. Oops. Oh, I have it hidden. Okay, there we go. So here's my smoothed representation of this data. And again, it's using these running averages of my values. So this is one way that we can get a representation of the data. And depending on how noisy actually, I just realized, I know what, I was gonna say, this is a very good looking smooth graph. It's because I wasn't using the noisy data to begin with. This makes a little bit more sense. So now what you see is, just to make sure this is clear, since I selected the wrong column to begin with, I selected the smooth column just to smooth out. Here I have my X data as input, my Y noisy data. I guess just to be clear, so you're aware, actually the smoothing algorithm within this column does not even require an X to be specified. Many of the other actions do, like integrating and differentiating. Smoothing actually doesn't, but for the plot action column to work, you do still have to specify that column. Anyway, now what we'll see as we change the number of points that are used in my smoothing, that I change my line here. Let me increase this a little bit. So maybe you can see this a little bit better. Here's my average of 1, which is not averaging. And when I increase the number of points that I use in my average, I smooth this out further and further. The drawback here is that, well, what am I doing? I'm actually shifting now my curve on the x-axis. So for our data, the COVID data, that could be a concern because you want to represent on a particular day the best value you can. One of the things that you can do, if you say do an average of 5, is that you can shift those values back. So I could use my expression and use the row number to plot a shifted version of that. But I want to show you actually an even better way to do this, or maybe I shouldn't say better, different, a way that I certainly think is a little more elegant. That said, the nice thing about the running average is that it's very easy to calculate and it's easy for people to understand. So if you do want to use this, and then I would just have you, again, use that method of referring to different row values to shift up the value by, in this case, if you're using a moving average of 5, you would shift it by 2, and then you would line up your smooth data with your actual data. And in fact, I'll show here in red, in case this isn't clear. This is my actual function, and the line underneath is my smoother version of that. All right, so the other thing that I want to show you, the way that I'm going to smooth in the data file that you have, is to actually use a fit function. And the fit command is available up in the toolbar. I'll go ahead and add the fit command here to my list of commands. And let me just actually hide some of these lines for now, and we'll just look at the underlying data. And in fact, I don't know if many of you do this, but there's a little button here that we can switch our view between our data and our commands. And since I have a lot of commands now, and I don't really need to look at the data, I can click that button in order to get my commands on the left-hand side. Now I can make this graph a little bit bigger for you. Okay, so the LOESS function is the one that we're going to use. This is a technique for smoothing out data. It's non-parametric, meaning that it does not assume any underlying specific function to our data. And if I choose this, right off the bat, I get a function back that is almost exactly the function that I started with. In fact, in this case, I visually can't tell the difference between the two. And what I want to point out to you is some of the options that you have on here. So when you use the LOESS fit function, what this is doing from a mathematical perspective is these are low order fits on windows throughout your graph. So you can specify what window do you want to use for determining the fit within a given region. By default, this is set to use a slider where I can change the window from using none to using the entire set of data. Here, it doesn't make a big difference. On some of the data I'll show you after, it will make a bigger difference. You can also do this as a first order fit, which is really a local linear fit, versus a second order, which is a local quadratic. Again, it's a little bit of a matter of trying out both and seeing what appears to give a better representation of the data. But if I want, I can specify the exact window over which I'm using to create this function, this local function. And I can, for example, here, I could say a window of 2 or a window of 5. Again, I'm not seeing a huge difference, although if I make my window very big here, that means it's averaging over the entire set of data. So it's not doing a very good job at representing my information locally. I would want to have a value for my area of fitting that is consistent with how much resolution I want with my data. Okay, I hope that that makes some sense and gives you some understanding of how the LOESS fit works, because that's what I want to use in doing these moving averages. So now let's go ahead and get back to this COVID datasets example that you see here. And let's start with the data that I have that's from let me make sure I get the name correctly. If you go over, if you hadn't seen this file before, if you weren't in the webinar last week, then the first tab, or the first graph here has some documentation in terms of where the data comes from. This is from the European Center for Disease Prevention and Control. And this is again, a data set. Every day they upload this and have done a nice job of keeping this data in a nice format for us. Here's the format of the data itself, where we have the date that these values are reported. This is by country code. We have also already separated by day, month, and year, if that's how you want to, if you want to include that. In data graph, we actually can aggregate very easily based on different timestamps, so we don't necessarily use that. Both in terms of cases and death rate or deaths. We have the country name, an ID, and the continent that these are on. So there's a lot of information that's in here. Also, yeah, they give the population data in 2018. So what we did really last week is we did a lot of examples. I'll just do a blank graph in here just to kind of get us started, where we use the pivot command to represent this data quickly. And I can take my data, I could highlight by the date column that you have here. We could use the country code or the country name. And if I want to use the cases, what I'm doing is clicking on the title and then using the command button to hold that down when I'm clicking on other columns that I want to include. Then I can click the pivot command in order to get a pivot of the data. Now we have some already set up that are set up in the way we want, but just again, in case you are coming to this new, we have to move this into categories. I would probably change this to a smaller unit of measure, maybe weeks, and using the stacked representation, now we can see the total, and we see this over all these different countries. So last week we did a bunch of that. And again, if you, I'll post that webinar soon, but you can go through and see how these are done in more detail. But what we didn't do is we didn't map these to anything other than country. Now for this data, this is actually very easy because there's already continent built into this data set. So I don't have to do this by country. I could do this by the continent. And now you see the same graphic that I have up here in the thumbnail. We can add a legend to this. And now I have a summed value across each of the continents. But what we want to do is, we'll talk about ranking in a moment, but I really want to get to the graphs that you see here and show you how to create these. Because one of the things that I really like about data graph is that you don't have to do serious modifications to your data, particularly data in this format, this is what we refer to as this flattened format, where you have these very long columns. And we can really, again, use these tools like masks and the pivoting in order to tease out different aspects of the data without having to do any kind of copying and pasting or manipulation of the data, the raw data. So how do I do a graph like this when I have a table of 17,000 rows and say I just want to include just the data from the United States? Let me go ahead and, again, we'll make a blank graph. And the first thing that I would want to do here is I need to know what columns of data I'm going to work with. So I have time that I want on my x-axis, and I'm going to have cases on my y-axis. So I could go into my new graph, and the command I'm going to use to draw the bars is called the bar command. So just to be clear, there is a bars command on your toolbar that's really more for side-by-side bars or categorical bars. If I want to give you a bar like this, that's just individual, that is on a numerical scale, then the command that we can use is under the command menu, and it's called just simply to add bar. So I've added this bar command. And the key here is that I'm going to use a mask in order to filter just the data that I want to see for a particular country. So first of all, the values that I want to show are the cases. So I can go ahead and in this command, I can make value cases. I'm starting to have all this data pop up here. And the where, this is, again, maybe a little different than some of these other plotting commands, but the where is going to be the date. So again, I don't know if this is some of you, depending on what version of Datagraph you're using, maybe you haven't even seen this yet, but you can click on these title bars and drag them and drop them right on the menu selectors. I've gotten to rely on that a lot in this version. I find it really helps. So here I have a bar graph that's forming, but this has all of my data in it for all the countries. I want to just show it for a particular country. So that's where masking comes in, where I can say, I want to pick a particular country code. You'll see the use as mask option. I'm going to take this and drag it here. And by default, the option that pops up for this is a logical statement that we can add in, is going to be inclusive value, and it says lies inside. We'll go ahead and change this to matches. This allows me to add a text string in, and if I want to say US, for example, I can go ahead and do that. And now I'm starting to get the data in a way that makes more sense, where I have my bar graphs over time, and I have it just for the US. And I can go ahead and format this a little bit. Let's go ahead and add a fill color. And one of the things that I really recommend people do as much as possible is, rather than just picking colors from the color picker, is to really rely on these built-in colors, because even if it's not the color you want, then we can use the colors in that list are in this style menu. So I'm going to use the line color 1 for this, and I'm going to use this again for both my both for my bar graph as well as the fit that I'm going to do of this data. So anyway, so I've created just for starters, the simple bar graph based just on data for one country. Now let's do my fit for this same data. And to do that, I'm going to add my fit command. I click that in the toolbar, and I'm going to, this is another shortcut I use all the time. You can click on a menu that's already selected, hold the command key, and drag it to another menu to have that same menu value selected there, populated there. So I have my date. I can just confirm that I've got the right columns here. Cases, that's exactly what I wanted to have as my X and my Y. And the fit function I'm going to use is this LOESS fit. And I'm going to, let's see, I'll need to zoom in on this a bit. Let me change this to be, oh, I know what I didn't do yet. So what I didn't do yet is I didn't add the mask. That's why I have this flat thing here. So I've already added a mask into my bar graph to get the data that I want. And once you create a mask in one command, you don't need to recreate it over and over again. That would be sort of tedious. Go into the gear menu, select copy mask, go into the gear menu where you want to apply that mask also to the fit, and then you can do paste mask. So now the same mask is being used for both of my data sets, and you can see this dark line here is the LOESS fit of that data. This is using the default setting. Again, there's this concept of the window that's being used to do this averaging. So I can change this window to, first of all, there's a slider that I could go back and forth. And notice if I have this, hopefully you can see this well on your screen through the webinar. But if I change this slider to be very small, it means my window that I'm averaging over is very small. But if I change it to be larger, I get a much smoother curve. If I make it too big, then it's actually now averaging over too much data, and I'm not being able to appropriately capture some of the curve. So how do you know what is a reasonable value to use for smoothing? Well, one of the things that's nice is that you can actually put in a value for the smoothing, a numerical value. I think I showed you that in the example we did to start with. But because this is a date column, I'm interested in using meaningful units for a date, for time series data. And data graph allows me to do that. So if I want to, let me say I want to average over a week, I can just type in the word week, and that is understood as a variable that represents a week of time, and then I don't have to do anything else. This is very handy for when I have multiple different data sets that I would like to use, and it would be important to make sure that my time window that I'm averaging over is consistent. If I want to do 2 weeks, because week is really just a variable that's representing this time period, I could do 2 times week, just put the number 2 in front of it. That's the same as typing 2 times. I don't have to put the operator in there. I can just put 2 in front of the variable name, and it would be averaging over that time period. I can also say day, let's see, 5 days, day or days. So you have, a lot of flexibility over that. And what I see people using very much is, again, this 5-day time period. Now, the 5-day window does seem to give you a good bit of oscillation. Sort of interesting. It almost seems it's I don't know if it's a real issue with the cases or if it's more of a reporting issue. But if you go up to 10 days, that seems to smooth out quite a bit. Maybe even 7 days would be enough. Now, the one thing I guess I didn't show you the option of is whether you use this first degree, what in this menu is first degree radius or second degree radius. So what this refers to is the degree of the low order polynomial that's fitting within these windows. If I make this a first, then it actually seems to do better with a 5-day average. So this is just linearly fitting between each of these points. And if I make it a second, it actually, in some ways, seems to do better with a longer. Anyway, so I think I've kind of myself gone between the two in terms of which is preferable. But because 5 days seems to be a standard that a lot of people are using, I think that's a reasonable value to select for this. Okay, so just checking our time. So this is just showing you how did I initially construct this in terms of the bar graph and the line graph. Let me show you a little bit more of the formatting that I did to create what it looks like here, because I think this is a really nice representation of the data and sort of looks clean. There's a couple of tricks that I usually do. One of them is to remove the lines around the bar graphs. That gives a nice clean look. The other thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to change my line style for my fit to the same line color as the bars. But because it's the same, it's hard to distinguish them between the two. So one of the tricks that I did here is I created a transparency in between these two commands. And this is created using a range command and setting the min and max to just blank them out to nothing here. So it means there's a transparency over the entire graph. Because these are layered, it adds a transparency or a transparent look to my bars without covering my line graph. So I'm actually just going to copy this and I'll paste it into this same command here, but move it in between the two. So again, these are drawn in layers. So I have my bar is drawn, my white layer that's transparent is drawn so you can still see the bars, and then my line drawn on top of that. And the reason that I am doing it like that is because I might change my mind about what color I'm using. And I have both my bars and my line set to be the color tile. That's the first color here in my menu. And if I want to change that and I want to keep these colors consistent, I can easily go into this color tile and change it here. And then both of my colors will update. Again, that changes the actual color that's in the menu. So you can customize this menu to have whatever colors you would like them to be. And that's how we go about doing that. Okay, so it does, I could just make this a transparent color, but then it would not be synced between the two. The other thing I really wanted to show you was that in my example here, I notice how I have a group on the outside of all of these. This is another thing that's pretty convenient. Rather than having individual masks in both of these commands, I can add a command group, place all of my commands within this group, and now the mask that I created here, I'm going to go ahead and copy this mask from my command, place it at the group level, and now I can just change these to, let's see, yeah, maybe this is right, fit all and draw all. The data didn't change because it's still being masked. It's just that I have a shared mask between these two commands. So the mask is just filtering to only include data where the country territory code is matching the USA. Now, I may want to use other countries here. So I can just type in a new country code, and that allows me to quickly change what country I'm seeing. But one of the things that we've done as Datagraph has evolved is we've tried to add in functionality to make it easier to use, to not have to always go and figure out, well, what do I need to type in for this particular or option or what's available to me. But I can also create menus that are global variables that are tied to these. So I could actually create a text variable that I put in here, but instead I have here these variables I created over here that allow me to just change from a drop-down menu the country that I'm viewing. And again, it's changing both. This is the same type of setup where I have this fit command. I also have a text variable that's, or text label that's using the variable that I have set up. And it's actually really fascinating to spend some time just going through and looking at these different countries to see how the data looks and comparing between different countries. It's interesting to do. I've spent a lot of time actually going through and doing that. I also have set up here an example where there are two different countries that are set up each with a different menu. And so you can compare them side by side. Here they're also compared as a joined version. I don't necessarily have time to go through how I created each one of these, but let me at least show you how to quickly create the menu because you can create anything you see that's in the variable list, you can create from scratch, but there's also a lot of shortcuts to creating them. So for example, if I pick that I want to pick country code where it, instead of saying matches, but choose the option called text is, you'll see there's a tooltip there that's comparing a text variable to an exact match. Maybe that's actually not a great tooltip, but really what this allows you is it's using a variable, but it also can use this drop-down menu. And I've already have some created, but if you're doing this from scratch, you can say create text menu, and then it creates for you this drop-down menu that has every option in it from whatever column I chose to base my mask on. Anyway, that's how I created that menu to begin with. I created it, I'll go ahead and just undo this, keep this one simple. I created these based on the country name to make this a little bit more meaningful, but it's all using sort of the same functionality. Are there any questions, I guess, on that and on moving averages before I talk about ranking? Okay, I'm not seeing anything right now, so I'll go ahead and keep going. And again, if you look at this, there's these other graphs here, also moving averages. These are using plots commands where I'm using these data specifically for the top 5 countries that have the total cases reported overall. Move my menu up there a little bit, or my title. So how did I determine what these top 5 were? Well, I did that using a pivot command. And if I go back to my graphs that I have here, I have a couple of different pivot commands that are doing ranking. In particular, here's the one that is showing the similar data. And if you go in and look at the command, you can see that there's a section for in this part where you specify how you want the rows to be set up. That over to the right, you can say you want them decreasing. By default, it will be automatic, and this is unranked or just organized alphabetically. And this graphic actually has a limit on it, so it will only show, if you go up into the axis settings, it's the top, it's actually, I set it up as a variable that you could change, so it can go from showing just 10 countries to 50 countries. So by default, it would show me the 10 alphabetical, but I can change this to be decreasing, and now it's showing me the countries with the most in this order. So it gives me this ranked list. And again, the ranking is being done for all the data, but I'm only showing the top 10. So let me show you how I did this one from scratch. Let me see if I can, oops, I cloned it. I actually want to make it, we'll make a blank graph. If I go over to my command here, what's often helpful actually is to, rather than starting completely from scratch, we already created this pivot command. Let's go ahead and use this as a basis for the next one. I can go ahead and take the command. I could have cloned, I guess, the graph, but I can take the command itself and drag it onto my new thumbnail. Now I'll go ahead and make some modifications to this. And instead of doing this by continent, I'm going to do this by the country name. And I'm going to go ahead and just change this to be decreasing. So now when I look at all of my different countries, actually I want to do this for, yeah, let me step back 1 minute, because notice how in the graph where I'm ranking this, I don't have dates in this graph. So this is one of the differences between what I'm doing here. Here I have the date on the x-axis. Here, I actually want the date to be, or the x-axis, instead of being dates, I want it to be the country code. Or actually, to be clear, I know this x-axis is not actually the country code. I have this pivoted to have the categories on the y-axis. I'm referring more to what's in the row that you see here. Okay, hopefully that didn't sound too confusing. But if you look at this, here I have my row now shows me a country code. We'll go ahead and have it be countries and territories. And my columns, I'll just leave as specify, because I want that to just show me the sum of all the cases reported. This is the cumulative number of cases reported for each one of these countries. And I want to have this now, instead of being in the automatic order, I want to have this in order that's decreasing. And again, it's handy just to look at the preview that you get within the pivot command. Let me go ahead and switch my views here to make this maybe a little easier to see. So the preview in the pivot command will help you to make sure that you're actually doing what you think you're doing. So here, the data is being summed across different countries, and it's being sorted with by a decreasing sort where the US is the highest one. Now, clearly the graph that you see here is not quite the same as the one I have here. This looks much nicer. So let me show you how I got from one to another. First of all, I think I'll just get rid of these grid lines for now. Whenever you have a graph that has the marks show a lot of grid lines, that can be something that's harder for the system to draw, so it can slow things down a little bit. The other thing is that I don't want to see all these countries. I want to see less of these countries, but I also find it convenient for graphs like this to have the category on the y-axis. I can change that really easily by changing this from X to, and actually I don't want this stacked, I want it standard. Now my countries are on the y-axis. I need a bit more room here though to see these. So I can change the amount of space I have on the y-axis. I'm using a 2-finger or a control click to get this setting through this shortcut. I can make this extra wide. That's maybe still not enough. In that case, I would go under the axis settings, change it to exactly, and I can create a lot more space on my y-axis if I want this to be particularly wide. Now the sorting though, the sorting order is off. I want the US up at the top, but if I change the sorting order here, that's not really what I want to do. It might look the way I want, but it's actually changing it in my table. So don't do that. Leave this table the way that you want to sort it, but you can change the type in the axis settings to reverse. So the US in this case is at the #1 location, but the graph is being represented on the y-axis from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 in the way that we would think of a ranking. Now, if I want to limit the number of countries I'm seeing, one really quick way is just to click on my graph and drag up. And now I can hone in on a lesser number of countries to get this ranked view. What I did with my graph here is I set it up to use this slider variable so that I could, let me go ahead and get back over here, so that I could actually change interactively the number of countries that I'm seeing on this graph. I could do the same thing here where I could say that, and this would be in my restrict setting, I could say that I want this to only go up to, say, the top 10. Now, because of the way the bars are centered on the on each center of this bar is at the number center at 1, center at 2. So you'd have to actually add a little bit extra in order to get the entire bar for the last one. And again, I have this variable called top. So what I did in my other graphs is I just said, okay, I'll use the variable top plus 0.5. See if I typed that incorrectly. See if my slider works. There it goes. So now I have this sort of a nice interactive component to this graphic where I can change how many are shown. And I can do some of the other things, like if you want to add labels, I can display the labels. I might not want that in scientific notation. it's probably better to go ahead and show these in terms of the standard notation that you see here. So anyway, so that's how I build the rank itself. And but often what I might want is to actually see this data, not just in this pivoted view, but I might want to be able to use this in other locations. So actually, let me go ahead and swap back, again, clicking on this button here. You know, this is sort of subtle, so I want to make sure people can see it. We've actually been debating having a shortcut to this command up on the toolbar, but have not done that yet. So now my data is on the left. I have my pivot command here on the right. And what I can do is I can extract the pivoted version of this data back into my data table. And the shortcut for doing that is to use the gear menu. If you click on that, you'll notice there's actually several options for extracting the data. If you choose extract result as flattened columns, it will sort the data alphabetically or numerically. It will not preserve the, and by numerically, I mean numerically more by the date rather than the rank if you have dates in there. But what we want to do is extract it as the pivoted columns the way that we sorted it. So choose extract all pivot columns. Let me hide the raw data. Now I have in a table a ranked version of all of my data showing the number of cases for each country. And I could quickly change this to show it by the number of deaths. I also have in here calculated the cases per population. That gives me another way to sort this, or I could do this by the number of deaths per population. So there's you know, a number of different ways to do this and to see this. Now, one of the things that's interesting in this case is you'll notice that this first row has to do with the case where there were a number of cases on the on a ship. We may not want that particular data point in this graph if I was doing this, for example, based on population, and that can be something that I could easily remove. So if I notice that, well, this is not data that makes sense for what I'm looking for, I can right click on this, I can copy that entire text, and I could add that as a mask also. And I can say, in terms of my countries, that I don't want to include things that are a match for that phrase. And now this ranking makes more sense. Now I actually see the countries that are there in that ranked view. Okay, so we have just a couple more minutes until noon. Does anyone have any questions? I hope that this was helpful. Also, I guess if there are other things that you're interested in, is there something I didn't cover in this webinar that you were hoping to see? There's a lot of examples that are in this file that hopefully you can kind of play with and see how they work. But the basic techniques for how I did most of this are just what you see here, playing with this ranking, playing with pivoting different data, summing it in different ways, using different types of masks. I guess quickly, one of the things I did not cover that you might notice here in the view on the left is that I have a couple of variables here that are the variable type called the text set from column. And this is a combination of using the, actually it's these two variables. Let me open these up. These variables that you see here, these are the text set from columns. And this is sort of an interesting way to use this. Let me go to where this comes from. So what I'm doing here is I'm actually taking my, my region And I have a column that is using this to filter what countries I see. So if I want to, for example, if I'm just focused on a particular continent, if I'm looking at countries in Asia, for example, or I want to see countries in Europe or Africa, notice that when I click any of these continents, then this filter below also changes. So it will then, rather than having this big long list of countries to choose from, I can filter down my list of countries. And this is being used in this pivot command here. So this is something you can maybe play with on your own a little bit to see how this works, so that the continent or region pivot limits the actual list of countries that I see here. And then with this pivot, if I click away, let me unclear it and just check everything. Some of these are still a lot of different countries, but in any case, it gives you a way to filter down that list to countries that you might be more interested in. And you could go to further levels. You can have lists that filter multiple lists and use these in layers. Anyway, that is all I have for today. The webinar went for an hour, and I'm happy, again, if you have any follow-up questions, you can always email us at help@visualdatatools.com. We are also, again, interested in your feedback on other things that you would like to see for webinars in the future. One of the things that I am planning to do next week is to talk about animating data. And you may have seen one of the animations that we've done on the COVID data sets. We're animating the points. I want to talk about how I did that, show you how to do some basic animation and how you could do that for yourself. So again, thank you very much. Hope you have a good weekend, and take care.